building your own images, if you can use just the generic images that are already available, that's now available to you. So it cuts down on your work. And also, as we mentioned at the top, it is integrated with as a fully armed solution now, the Azure Resource Manager, which makes it much easier to deploy new resources and much easier to manage. So at Ignite, we did get that Intune support. We also have screen capture protection, which is another DLP policy that we have in place now. So it's harder for users just to, do a screen capture or use a snipping tool to capture something of that nature that they shouldn't be doing locally. If you're on this same network, or you're on a network that has access directly in Azure, there's not a direct RDP rather than going over a broker. So that's cool. Makes the user experience a little bit better, makes it more dependent on your network. And the two that we skipped there are actually probably the most exciting. MSIX App Attach is the ability to virtualize an application and then attach it dynamically to your session host. So rather than having your technical folks spend a lot of time creating images that have applications baked into them, you now have the option, you can use those shared gallery images that are generic a little more easily and just dynamically attach applications to them as you need to. So that's real exciting. We've been waiting on that for a really long time. And also there's another Azure Monitor workbook that was released that will make it a little bit easier for you to see your performance metrics from virtual desktops. You'll be able to see, hey, I need to scale down, I'm spending too much money, or oh, maybe I need to be more aggressive about scaling up because my user experience is maybe not what I want. You'll have more data like that that's more easily available to you. And these things we promised for by the end of the calendar year. We'll see how that goes. We do live in a post-COVID world now, and it has impacted Microsoft's timelines a little bit. They've been pretty good about it before COVID hits to hit their timelines, but they're a little bit lagging because of that right now, because it's like everybody else, they're trying to respond to the need and the desire that people have for compute in Azure now. So, but hopefully it'll hit these deadlines for this. And there's lots of training that's available for this. I've been through these. They're pretty good. I mean, you're not going to be an expert when you're done, but you're going to have a really good base understanding of virtual desktops. So I recommend checking these out if you're interested. Most of them are pretty short. This one's about 2 hours here. And then we can here quickly run a demo. And I'll show you kind of on the back end and also what the user experience will look like. So this is what virtual desktop looks like in Azure. I have already deployed what we call a host pool. A host pool is a collection of the virtual machines that make up your session host. So usually the way it works out is one host pool per use case. So you say, hey, I want to present a generic image to everyone, so everyone has a remote solution. But also I have, maybe 50 users over here that need a legacy application that I don't want to support on-prem anymore. I'm going to move that up to Azure Virtual Desktop. How do I present that? That would be a second host pool. That's kind of how you create that delineation and break it down. So if you look inside the host pool here, you see that we have 2 virtual machines dedicated to this, and they are set up where they will do load balancing. So the way I set up now is it'll load up one VM before it moves to the next. You can also do the other approach where it will equally assign sessions to each VM until you've reached the maximum threshold, which is something that's definable. And it will, using Azure Automation, it's not native to WVD yet, but using Azure Automation, it will spin up new virtual machines if you need to. And also there's some Azure Automation that will turn off all your virtual machines when outside of what you define as business hours. So you'll have one going. So, users, if they want to log in at 3 a.m. and work for whatever reason, will have that ability, but you don't have every single virtual machine running and costing you a lot of money. So that's the cool thing about how that works. Another very interesting thing is the ability to control the user experience a little bit. It is the same kind of, same kind of thought process as RDP properties. If you're on-prem and you want to access another computer, or you want to log into a server, it's a similar concept. You can drive what devices are redirected, which a lot of people want to do for security reasons. Hey, I don't want you to print, things of that nature. But the example they give here is around audio. So, hey, I want my mic to work because I want to use a soft phone, or I want to use Teams, something of that nature. I want to be able to hear what people are saying because I'm connecting through my VDI. And there's also a cool new thing that we've been waiting on for a long time that finally came to general release this week called Teams AV Redirect, for those who are invested heavily in Teams, that takes the problem that we traditionally have with VDI and voice, and it solves it by putting all the processing either on the endpoint the user is connecting from or up in Azure. So they don't have all that choppy audio anymore. So that's something that's really exciting they released in that space. But there's all sorts of things you can do there to make sure you've customized the user experience the way that you want it to be and the way you're getting feedback for it. And then controlling these again, very simple, just using Azure Active Directory groups. They have added some automation tasks in here, which is very cool. So you can go through and add tasks to do things like patching them. If you didn't want to use your traditional on-prem utilities to do that, which would be what I would recommend, is take a cloud first focus to how you're going to do that. Well, that's kind of what it's about from the back end. From a user experience standpoint, I'm going to use the thick clients, which is what I recommend. There's two versions of this. There's one that you can intermittently get out of the Microsoft Store. It looks exactly the same as the one you can download from the internet, but the features are different. So I would not recommend at this time using the one from the store. Stick with the one that you can download from the internet. If you roll it out broadly, I would go to the effort of pushing out the client to all your endpoints so everyone has it readily available. We have to worry about where they can find it and things of that nature. But when you log in, it just gives you this. So if I had applications that were presented to me as well, those would show up here. This says default desktop. That's a customizable setting. So if you wanted to present 3 or 4 desktop experiences or a little bit different, you can name them whatever made sense logically. That's very customizable. But if we click on it, it will launch. It looks just like RDP. It's very similar. It will ask you to log in twice. And while that's happening, it's first asking you to log in to remote desktop, and it's authenticating you against Azure AD, which we've already done. You guys can see that part. And the second time I ask you to log in, you're actually logging into the virtual machine. So that's why that's happening. And then I have 3 monitors, so it very unhelpfully decided that it was going to maximize it across all 3, which is one of those settings that you can set in the RDP settings to avoid that from happening. But you see, if I do that, it gives me this weird experience. But that's just because I have too many monitors. But at this point, I have a fully fledged, let me hide this, a fully fledged virtual desktop running in Azure. I believe I have Office on here. I do. So if I loaded any other applications on here, I can do whatever I wanted. And as long as there is a network connection between Azure and your data center, if you have applications that require connection down to some infrastructure or some backend in your data center, those applications will work, right? So usually there's some firewall configuration that has to go along with that. So a little bit of trial and error to get it where you want it to be, but that's all fully supported. So it's just like a user walking into an office and logging into their PC. They can now, from anywhere they have an internet connection, hit virtual desktop, load up this desktop here, this remote desktop, and do their job. And from a network standpoint, most people have pretty solid network connections or internet connections these days. So they don't see a lot of issues with latency. The real big issue is still reaching across from Azure down into your data center. And for that, it just depends on your application, right? And also if you have a VPN, what size pipe you have, or if you have ExpressRoute in place, either supported. And we'll touch on that here in just a second. But from that standpoint, that's the only network concern that you really have, and that's something that's in your control, right? It's not out of your control. So that's how that looks for an end user. So we'll bounce back over to our presentation. So here are some of the scenarios that I was just talking about via the network scenario and how you would join devices to different infrastructure. So these devices, these virtual machines, do have to be joined to Active Directory of some sort. So it can be your local Active Directory infrastructure. It can be Azure Active Directory domain services. It cannot be just Azure Active Directory. That does not fulfill the requirement. So at least one of those needs to happen. Most people already have a connection of someplace in place between Azure and their data center, so they'll just use Active Directory. Some people will go the route of deploying domain controllers and whatnot into Azure to support this and other Azure-based workloads. That just really depends, the personal preference. A lot of people tell you it's best practice, but it really comes down to the network connection that you have, right? Are you going to saturate your network connection and integrate other services by setting up the scenario where they're reaching across the pipe to talk to Active Directory? And then from a user standpoint, you have a couple different scenarios there. Most people are Office 365 customers, so they've already synchronized all their users to Azure Active Directory with AD Connect. So that really solves that problem, because as long as they're in the same tenant, you can make sure their licenses are signed and they'll have rights to do this, and they won't have any issues accessing remote desktop, virtual desktop. The other scenario that we sometimes run into is it will live in its own tenants or its own subscription or its own Azure Active Directory instance. In that case, you just have to have cloud-based users, right? So it's just a little bit different way that you manage it versus synchronizing your users from on-prem. And here's how it kind of works, right? You can see the different clients we talked about here. It's going over this broker and then into the actual infrastructure that resides in Azure and in your local data center. You see there are a couple of firewalls in place there that Microsoft manages for you. But this broker here in the middle is really the secret sauce that makes it secure. It makes it very easy to manage, because you don't have to manage any of that yourself with some kind of load balancer like a NetScaler or F5 or any kind of solution, right? Microsoft takes care of all of that for you. And it talks a little bit about the different ports and how traffic is flowing back and forth. Patch management is a big topic that we get around virtual desktop, because there's two questions that usually come into play. It's one, how do I manage the images that I've created? Because potentially you have several different images, different managed images or images that live on blob storage. And the other one is, how do I actually update my virtual machines? So there's different ways to go about it. I recommend taking a very cloud first kind of focus to that, right? Use Azure Automation. There are tools in place that will automatically upgrade the session hosts of the virtual machines for you. Already exists in Azure. If you have a significant investment in technology or process with something like Configuration Manager can do all those things for you as well. You can treat them just like any other endpoint if you wanted to. The only thing to keep in mind is, you don't want to patch these VMs during the middle of the day. You don't want to give users the option to patch them themselves, because you potentially have several users on one VM. And you don't want one user going, oh, I'm going to be proactive and do it, and the VM reboots, and then 8 to 10 users have a bad user experience and they call the help desk and they yell at people. So you can avoid that by just making sure your maintenance windows are set. You do that off hours, right, when you expect demand to be low. But where you can, always recommend doing a kind of an Azure first type of approach to get that done, just for the best user experience and also the best manageability experience for you guys. Because that way you're not looking at having to change it in the future as the Microsoft technologies grow and mature. And that's really it, guys. We have any questions? I was anticipating a couple more questions while we were talking. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I thought maybe some people would speak up. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions?
It's a quiet group, Eileen.
Well, that's why I tried to leave my face up there for you, so you'd have someone to speak to. So. Everybody loves to hide their face. So.
Oh, yeah. I didn't turn my camera on because I still have bed hair. So.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Spoken from a true bureaucrat here at Chipola College. I'll let Matt White, the technical guru, take care of most of this stuff, but I do get involved with the Microsoft, what we used to call the campus agreement, the EES agreements now that have Microsoft licensing, but we also have a separate contract with Microsoft Azure for cloud storage and AD in the cloud as well. I'm just curious about the licensing involved for this. Now, I know you spoke about actually how licensing for the virtual desktops were actually included if you had certain things in place already. But I guess I'm more concerned about the charging algorithms. I don't have any idea what to expect or how to calculate what I should try to budget should we want to move to a virtual desktop scenario. Do you have any guidance or direction as to how I can find out more information about that?
Absolutely. So from a purely licensing standpoint, you get the nail on the head, right? You probably already have licenses for it, because the only licenses you need is to allow either Windows or Office to activate. So if you have an A3, a Microsoft 365 A3 already in place for all your users, you're covered, right? A3 or above.
Right.
There are different licenses that cover that. You know, if you have individual Windows A3 licenses or the Office licenses, that'll also cover it, right? So a couple different scenarios there. From a Azure compute cost standpoint, you know, the amount of cost you're going to generate is dictated by a couple of things. It's one, what applications am I going to make available, and what are the resource requirements for those applications? Because, you know, if you have, say, I know that, I don't know if Scott's here, but Scott at HCC has a requirement for one of his labs that they use some sort of Autodesk software, right? So, you know, things like AutoCAD, that's resource intensive. You're probably going to need GPU-enabled virtual machines to keep up with the graphics requirements, which is an option. You can turn that on. And that's going to drive your costs up a little bit. But if you understand how many users you're going to have and you understand the requirements for that application, you can say, okay, I've got 100 users. I know I'm going to need this series or this size VMs because I need, you know, this CPU, this memory, and I know that I'm going to need to have them GPU enabled. You can go out to the Azure calculator and you can pop it in and you can say, you know, I need this many VMs. I think they're going to be running probably 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, right? So you're going to have one that runs all the time, but you expect them to run this many hours otherwise. And then you can spit out a number for that. The only other thing to really keep in mind that number won't show you unless you go out and you actually add it in is what sort of cost am I going to have going across my either express route or VPN tunnel that you probably already have in place, right? And that's usually only going to be things like infrastructure, like I'm patching, or you're talking to Active Directory, things of that nature. So as long as you understand the resource requirements of the applications and the use cases that you want to present, you can get a pretty accurate number. And also there are several mechanisms inside of Azure that you can do to kind of track the cost as you go. So if you get a number, you set a budget, and you see that you're approaching that, say, you know, 20 days into the month, you can say, okay, something's going on. You know, we're not budgeted for this. We can just scale back. When you look at some other solution we want to do to address the gap of these 10 days we have left in the month, and then also figure out why this happens or doesn't happen again next month, right? So you can track that sort of thing and prevent budget overages that way as well. And that's something that we typically do with all of our customers when we run through it. You know, step one, let's understand your applications. And then step two, let's walk through the Azure calculator so you have a good idea of what your cost would look like.
Okay. Well, if I'm understanding the presentation appropriately, I think it could probably help us in multiple areas. One being, we require all of our students right now to sign on. We're a Microsoft Windows environment, obviously. And of course, in Windows 10, every time they do that on a different machine, of course, a profile is built. And over time, it requires us basically to reimage the machines every semester because the profiles basically take over the machines.
Right.
So that's an issue. And also, if I'm understanding it correctly, it sounds like it could be a viable alternative for the general user as a substitute for VPN.
Correct. 100% on both of those. So the thing about imaging your computers every month or every summer, right, whenever that cycle is for you guys, is with FS Logics, if they're using virtual desktop, those profiles aren't stored in those virtual machines. Those are stored in a network share somewhere, right? And there's different ways you can implement that. You can do an SMB share. You can do Azure NetApp files, which the Microsoft folks are really interested in. And then you can also use Azure files in certain situations. There's some limitations there if they haven't addressed yet. It's really only for clients who are using Azure Active Directory domain services, that comes into play. you get different options, right? And you keep all that in Azure, so you don't have that traffic going over your VPN tunnel. And then absolutely, right, you don't have to worry about managing a VPN solution anymore because they can just hit virtual desktop. So, and all it needs is an internet connection. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Sure. Jesse, I saw your question. These are the people that you want to talk to. George is on the call with us. George is one of our cloud strategists. And then his account salesperson that he works with is Dina. Dina is great. And I have their phone numbers and their email addresses out here. So if you guys are interested in doing a pilot for this, those are the folks to reach out to talk to.
And just to throw in, even, you know, if you just want to talk through other solutions or other things that might help you, you know, we're happy just to jump on a call with you. When that previous question, Jerry, it made me think of HCC and where you did the right filter in there, you know, because that would be another solution for him. So there's, you know, other ways to skin the cat, although I'm a huge fan of WBD.
Yeah, you know, there's several different ways to solve different problems. That really comes down to what's most cost effective for an individual college, right? And it's not just the Azure cost, it's now we got a management where our skill sets of our people lie, right? What's best for us? And like George is saying, we can walk you through all those different scenarios and we can arrive at what's going to work best for you guys and help you get it implemented if you're interested.
Does anybody else have any questions?